if you are just joining us, welcome to our Wednesdays at 1. Today is, what is today? The 20th of May. I can't believe it. It's been a little over 2 months since we have been sheltering in place and social distancing. So for all of you out there, just keep hanging in. We're officially in phase 1 in Virginia of reopening, and that has brought up a myriad of questions and concerns and issues related to employees' health, employee safety, consumer safety, customer interaction. And so today's Wednesdays at 1 is dedicated to help everyone and all of our organizations in the community reopen safely. So to start, I will just mention a couple of upcoming events, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and we'll get right started. So tomorrow, we have our Lessons with Leaders that Leadership Lynchburg puts on. That'll be at 10 a.m. And we are interviewing Dr. Nancy Hubbard with University of Lynchburg. She's the Dean of the Business School, but her background is in global strategy and acquisitions and communications. So we will talk to her real time about how she is navigating crisis management. She's on the crisis management team at University of Lynchburg, and how they are approaching strategy in the midst of so much that's uncertain. So that's 10 a.m. Tomorrow at 1, we are also hosting a webinar, an interactive webinar called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, irregardless of COVID. And so we have the Global Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion from Genworth, who hails from Richmond, who's going to be leading that discussion. So all of you HR folks that might be interested in that conversation, that's at 1 o'clock. You can find out all the details of those, as well as all of our upcoming webinars at lynchburgregion.org. I will mention, if you have not picked up our Response, Recovery, Renewal Quick Guide, that is under the COVID Hub on our website, lynchburgregion.org. But that has, just like it says, a quick guide of reopening. We are working on a more comprehensive guide. As you all know, the CDC came out today with their 60-page document. And so we are marrying some local resources, some state resources with the CDC guidelines, and hope to have a more comprehensive regional document to you in the next couple weeks. But without further ado, I want to welcome you all to today's conversation around legal, HR, and employment updates with regard to reopening. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We're going to start with John Falcone, and I'll have John introduce himself and where he works and what he does. He's been a longtime friend of the Alliance. And he's really smart. If you look at all those books behind him, he's got them all memorized, he said, as we got started. And then following John, we have Stuart Weitzel with Schewel's Schewel's Home. And so he'll be talking about some HR issues to think about, not just from the legal perspective that John's going to start with, but how to navigate employee safety, customer safety. And you have quite a few retail operations, so it'll be good to hear from you. And then we'll finish up with Jason at our local VEC center. Lots has happened since we had Jason on the first time, which was right after we went into shelter in place. And your center has just done a remarkable job amidst amazing demand. And so we want to get an update on how things are going. We've had some questions around claims and from an employer perspective. So we'll talk to Jason about that in just a little bit. But to start, John Falcone, talk a little bit from your perspective about your line of work, your practice, and then we'll go right into, I gave John some bullets based on some issues that our employers were facing. So we're gonna let John kick us off.
Well, thank you, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone. Christine has given me a list of things that will probably take about 3 hours to cover, but we're going to cram it all in about 10 minutes. So let's jump right in. She asked me to comment first about the new legislation that the Virginia General Assembly passed this term. And there's a lot in the employment law area. Employment law is my area. I practice with the Lynchburg law firm at Petty, Livingston, Dawson, and Richards. In the employment area, the General Assembly was very active this year. And I just want to highlight a few of the laws that they did pass and that the governor signed. There are many, many of them, but these are just highlighting some of the major ones. There's something now called the Virginia Values Act, which is a huge change in Virginia law. This essentially enacts a lot of protections, of anti-discrimination and other protections, very similar to the laws that are regulated by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So there's a lot to this Virginia Values Act. For example, it prohibits discrimination based on a sexual orientation or sexual identity, which is a big change in Virginia law. So this is something that all employers need to be aware of. We do a blog on this, and this is one of the subjects that I have blogged about. There's also a wage law. So the minimum wage is going up in Virginia. It's going up in phases. The first phase, which was actually delayed a little bit from the original legislation, but the first phase kicks in on May 1st of next year. And the current hourly minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. It will go up to $9.50 per hour on May 1st, and then in incremental steps in following years, all the way up to $15 an hour on January 1, 2026. This is something the General Assembly, of course, can tweak in the future, but at the moment, that's where we are. So minimum wage is going up, and there are a number of other aspects to the wage law as well, but that's the key one. And then finally, a big change in Virginia law, it concerns non-compete agreements. Previously, Virginia didn't really regulate non-competes very much other than decisions of the Virginia Supreme Court. But now the General Assembly has banned non-compete agreements for low-wage employees. Now, what is a low-wage employee? Well, the law says that it's tied to the average weekly wage of the Commonwealth as determined by the Workers' Comp Commission. And as of July 1 of this year, that will be $1,137 per week. So an employee making that amount is going to be considered a low-wage employee, and you can't use a non-compete agreement with that employee. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, salespeople and others whose earnings are derived from commissions. You have to look carefully at those exceptions, but that is a big change in the law. So there are many other changes the General Assembly made. We don't have time to go into them all, sorry, Christine. But so let's talk about coronavirus related issues. So we've been getting a lot of questions about employer liability for reopening and also in related to coronavirus. First of all, one of the key questions we've had is, if I reopen, if I'm an employer and I reopen, am I going to be liable for anything because I reopen? Well, the quick answer is, if you follow the state and federal guidelines, the governor's orders, the state health department, the CDC guidelines, you should be safe as far as liability. There shouldn't be any liability against you for reopening if someone gets sick, for example, as long as you're following those guidelines. Now, there are some other areas of potential liability that you do have to be aware of. One question we've been getting is, what if I've laid off an employee and the employee doesn't want to return? Well, the answer to how you handle that depends on whether you, the employer, got a Paycheck Protection Program loan or whether you didn't. If you did get one of those loans, then in order for that loan to be forgiven, you do have to bring back employees who you laid off, as long as you do it before June 30th, or an equivalent number of employees. But if you make an offer to a laid off employee to come back to work, and that employee refuses, It says, I don't want to come back to work. I'm making too much on unemployment. We'll let Jason talk about that. But as long as you have made the offer to the employee, if the employee declines to return, that doesn't count against you for purposes of the forgiveness of the Paycheck Protection Act. Now, you should do it in writing just to make sure that there's a paper trail for that. But what if you make the offer to an employee and you don't have a Paycheck Protection loan? Well, then you're not worried about loan forgiveness in that case, but there are considerations of unemployment. So if the employee has been laid off, is drawing unemployment, and you make an offer for them to return and they decline it, it's my understanding that the VEC will rule them as being ineligible for continued unemployment benefits. I'll let Jason Padgett with the VEC address that issue. But so there's a different treatment for how you deal with employees who will not return, depending on whether you get the Paycheck Protection loan. Now, if you do not have a Paycheck Protection loan, and you have employees who are saying, well, I can't come back. I have a health condition that is preventing me from returning. Well, there are different considerations about that. So first of all, there are two exceptions to the paid leave rules. There's another federal law. We love all these acronyms. There's the PPP and the federal law called the Families First Coronavirus Protection Act, FFC-RA. And that law provides for paid leave for employees in some circumstances. Now, there are two main categories of exceptions. If you're a small business and it would seriously harm your business to have to provide this paid leave, then you are exempt under certain circumstances. Small business is considered under 50 employees. Also, if you're a healthcare employer, there's an exemption for healthcare employers under this paid leave law. But if you're not exempt and an employee is out of work for coronavirus-related reasons, then you potentially are going to have to pay them a certain amount of leave. Now, under some circumstances, it's up to 2 weeks of pay. In other cases, it can be potentially up to 12 weeks under an expanded FMLA. The rules for this are found in an employee rights poster, a very handy poster that all employers are required to post. But there are 6 categories of employees, and depending on where you fall in those categories, that determines what your paid leave rights are. So if you don't have that poster, get it, put it up, and refer to it. And it's actually a very handy guide to the rules for paid leave. So I encourage all employers to be referring to it. So another question we're getting is, what if an employee is anxious about coming back, doesn't want to come back because they're afraid of what's going to happen in the workplace? I'm sure Stuart seeing that. I know Stuart is seeing that already. Anxiety under the coronavirus situation is not considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's not really considered a good reason for an employee not to come back to work. And again, for unemployment purposes, that should apply as well. It's not a disability that must be accommodated by an employer. Now, having said that, I mentioned that there might be an underlying health condition that might require an accommodation. That gets complicated, but just keep in mind that the Americans with Disabilities Act might apply in a case like that. So finally, let me just touch on briefly medical privacy issues, HIPAA and the Americans with Disabilities Act. HIPAA, the medical privacy law that protects privacy of medical information, really does not apply to the employer-employee situation, except to the extent that an employer is getting information from the employee health plan. But if an employee tells the employer, I've been tested and I've been found to have COVID-19, that information is not protected by HIPAA. If the employer finds out about that or the medical condition somehow through the employer's health plan, then that is covered. But otherwise, if the health plan is not their source of information, that information is not protected by HIPAA. However, the Americans with Disabilities Act might protect some medical information. The rules about the ADA are pretty complicated, but just keep in mind that in some circumstances, you might not be able to reveal certain information that you've learned through certain circumstances. Now, the ADA does allow you to make medical inquiries in the coronavirus situation that you ordinarily would not be able to make. The EEOC has issued some guidance that loosens some of the restrictions about what you can ask an employee under the ADA. So ordinarily, you can't ask medical information of an employee. For example, if you're getting ready to hire somebody, you cannot ask them about medical conditions prior to offering them a job. You are able to ask them to have a medical exam after you offer the job, and can condition the job offer on the results of the exam. But in the coronavirus situation, the EEOC has said, for example, that after you offer them the job, you can request that they be examined, or you can insist that they be examined for coronavirus, that they be tested. You can do some basic testing. For example, you can take the temperatures of employees. A lot of employers are doing that, automatically taking temperatures of employees coming to the workplace. So there are a number of other complex rules here. I don't want to intrude though on Stuart's time here, so I'll stop and happy to answer any questions later.
Yeah, thank you, John. Hopefully that answered some of the main, I know it answered some of the main questions we were getting, but if you have questions, please remember to use the chat feature, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of our featured speakers time. And I promised Stuart, if we didn't have any questions, he was going to explain the employee algorithm equation behind him. So he's hoping you all are going to ask lots of questions. So.
Well, I actually thank you, Christine. And I love listening to John, because every time I do, I learn something new. So
Right.
What a wealth of information. I appreciate you having me on here. I will say very quickly that Bill Varner, who's apparently on the webinar, has texted me and asked me already about what's going on my whiteboard. So
we're going to get to that, whether you like it or not. You should erase that before we started, because. But yeah, Stuart, please talk about some things to help some of our HR folks from an employee and consumer standpoint in terms of reopening, what you guys have done and what you've thought through.
Sure. So first, I will preface, with Schewel Home, we have 50 retail locations. We have 52 work sites, central distribution warehouse, and then a corporate facility here in Lynchburg, obviously with our store on Timberlake Road. We made the decision not to close during the shelter in place, based off of the orders of the various states and the executive orders from the governors. So that's made things a little bit less difficult for us as we go through the process of getting back to business, so to speak. But I did put some things together. I think the biggest thing that we found through this process that's been very beneficial is being in consistent communication with your employees. I mean, just trying to touch base with them, letting them know the decisions that you're making and why you're making those decisions. We've had bi-weekly meetings with our leadership team, kind of our coronavirus task force, so to speak, here internally. And, as we make these decisions about staying open and closing, layoffs, furloughs, whatever that be, we're constantly having communication with our employees and letting them know why we're making those decisions. So I think communication is huge with that. I think that when you're talking about safety, Christine, I will tell you just from experience that early on in this, you really kind of have to think outside the box at how you approach some of these things, because I've told John this before in private conversations, there's no playbook for what we're doing right now. There's no roadmap, there's nothing to copy and steal, so to speak. And, early on when we made the decision to stay open, we had an issue of sourcing PPE for employees. John talked about the liability piece, about making sure that you're doing all the necessary precautions that the various, states are, requiring, in Virginia, the social distancing, the cleaning procedures, making sure that your staff has access to PPE. Well, we couldn't find hand sanitizer. We couldn't find cleaning supplies. I mean, I still can't find Lysol, right? So I'll tell you, just, and not to plug them, but just, you got to think creative. For an example, I have a colleague, a former colleague, a friend of mine who runs the House of Vacuums on Old Forest Road, small business here in town. They sold hand sanitizer. So they sourced it from the ingredients from one of their vendors. And so that's where we got our hand sanitizer, and it worked out great. I think about, the cleaning procedures, making sure that as you're bringing people back to work and you're bringing customers into your business, that you're taking cleaning, making it a priority to sanitize the area. I would recommend that you come up with like a cleaning schedule where you're making sure that you're hitting all the common areas, the touch points, entryways, common spaces, those type of things on a regular basis, once every hour or so. So you can have a checklist into that regard. I would also say that, you want to make sure you continue to do the social distancing guidelines, have signs in your store, have signs in your business, tape off areas, et cetera, like that. I think everyone understands right now, if you basically say, hey, you have to stand here or you have to stand there or something like that, everyone gets what we're going through. And like I said, everyone understands that there's certainly not a playbook for what we're doing. I'll give you a quick example of something we did internally is talking about just being creative is we altered our delivery procedures. We have 50, like I said, 50 stores, and a big part of obviously buying the merchandise is having it delivered to your home. And so, but now you're putting people in people's homes. You have employees going into people's homes. I mean, that's a real concern. So you want to make sure they have the PPE they need, the personal protective equipment they need to be safe. But then you also want to make sure that the customer is safe too. So we changed our full service delivery to what we call threshold delivery, where we basically told the customer on the onset, we're just going to get it into your house. We're just going to get it over the threshold. That's all we can really do for you right now. I'm sorry. And, if there's an extenuating circumstance, we'll look at that. Obviously we're not going to make an elderly woman carry a recliner up the steps, but we're going to just do our best to protect the customer and protect the employee. So even down to your sick policies, I'd recommend that every business really look at what their internal policy is about sick time, about calling out for sick, and really look at relaxing those. Early on when schools were canceled, we took a really liberal approach to that, especially with childcare. We were not going to discipline someone if they called out for a childcare issue, because it's not their fault that all the schools have been closed, right? And so same thing with sick. We want to encourage sick people to stay home and sick employees to stay home. So if they're sick and they call out sick, we're not going to discipline them for that purpose. So, and we're not going to require a doctor's note. That's one guidance we got from the CDC on that, because I know that early on they didn't want healthcare providers to be over flooded with all these visits. So the other piece I would say that I would touch on that I think that helped us a lot as we kind of got started in this process is that, we were talking about testing or, the plan for reopening, is that you really need to make sure that whatever you do, you have a plan for it. I think you should probably sit down and go through every scenario. What happens if an employee tests positive? What happens if an employee's spouse tests positive? What happens if an employee is exhibiting symptoms? What happens if a customer calls you and says, hey, I was in your store, I was in your restaurant, I was in your place of business last week, and I have COVID-19, and I've diagnosed positive for this. I think that those are really important to have. I mean, we basically built out a decision tree where we mapped every possible scenario, and we said, if this happens, we do this. If this happens, we do that. And the real benefit of that is, talking about there's no playbook for this, then you do have a playbook. So if something does happen, you have, a plan that you can go back to and say, okay, we have an employee in XYZ location who's tested positive. What do we do? Okay, we shut the store down. We do a deep clean. We test other employees if we can have access to that. That was early on. That was obviously a challenge, but now that's opening up a little bit more. Those type of things, having those scenarios planned out in advance, I think really have helped us as we've started to see more traffic flowing through and more business picking up, because, I hate to say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We're all going to have to face this situation at some point where one of our employees, one of our coworkers are ultimately going to call in, or they're going to say, hey, I've got the virus. I have the symptoms of the virus. What do I do? So I would just say, just make sure that you obviously have those things prepared in advance, and make sure you're doing obviously those your due diligence on what will we do if this happens. Christine, I'm not going to touch a lot on the unemployment piece of it, because I know that Jason's going to dig into that a little bit. But I will say that one thing from a HR standpoint that I think is important to note is, not so much about how the unemployment works, but just the whole concept of, how do I get an employee to come back to work? How do I do that? I really think employers now, like I said, they more than ever, they need to have consistent communication with their employees. They need to make sure that they're touching base with them. They're using technology, Zoom, webinars, calling them obviously on a consistent basis. But when they get to that point where, John Smith says, I'm making X amount on unemployment, and I don't want to come in because I ultimately am fearful. I have this anxiety about my health, so I'm going to stay home. I'm not going to come back to work. I think as an employer, you have to remind your employees about the, not just the extrinsic value, not just the paycheck or the benefits of your job, but the intrinsic value of having a job, the sense of pride and accomplishment, obviously, the sense of self-worth and those things, personal growth, personal achievement. I think that there's also, in coming back to work, there's obviously social benefits, mental health benefits. And I think a lot of people have been home for a long time, and they're ready to get back out and see other people and be around other people. And I think as an employer, they need to really highlight those things and make those points. And they need to make sure that they tell their employees, we're taking your safety as a priority, and they obviously need to take it as a priority. So getting them the necessary PPE they need, whether it's masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, those things, working with them to through these difficult situations. If they're sick, if they have childcare issues, being flexible. And then I think, ultimately, it really kind of goes back to a question of the employee has to answer is it's a question of risk. What level of risk is the employee comfortable taking? Is the risk worth the reward, both intrinsically and extrinsically? And I think the employee has to make that decision. Am I willing to risk potentially my health to come back for this job? And, obviously you're looking at 3 people here on this webinar that we're saying, yes, the risk is worth it. And I think there's more people out there that would say yes than no. So that's my hope.
That's good. Thank you, Stuart. I love the decision tree for scenarios. I think that's going to help a lot of folks just to plan for the worst and have that planned out. So thanks for sharing.
That's what this equation really is. That's what it is.
So you're not getting off the hook on that one. Okay, so Jason, if you'll give us an update on unemployment, and then I do have a couple questions in the chat. So John and Stuart, get ready.
Okay.
All righty, let me get this started. So to get started, some of the questions about how many calls, what is the volume looking like? for the VEC, and so I can, go over some of that locally. So we are averaging about 900 calls per week since the first week of April, and maybe even really the last week of March. It has really been a wave. It's been a challenge in that at the very beginning in March, it was really the questions were, how do I apply? Where do I apply? I can't get through on the phone, which that's still the answer. But, so we were directing people to the website, explaining, what the categories were. From the very first meeting I did here, I was able to do a few Zoom meetings with employers to review this information, to go over the filing process. So that work continues. There are nearly 10,000 continuing claims for the Central Virginia region. So, I don't want to describe this as this is the unemployment rate, because it's a different way of how that survey works. But, it's not that hard to figure out. There's about 100,000 people in the workforce for our region, for the Central Virginia region. So, the 100,000, to have 10,000 continuing claims, it is a lot. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. To give you some perspective on that, the very first week of March, I think it was like 972 continuing claims. So just in the 2-month time period, you've gone from an average of 900 people, almost to 1,000, all the way to 10,000. So it's quite a difference. Common questions were how to file partial unemployment has really caused a lot of phone calls, a lot of issues. The reason being, under normal circumstances, when someone only works part-time or works 20 hours, the employer completes a form that explains how many hours were offered. The employee signs off and says, yes, this is how much I worked, and that is filed with the agency. Under this enormous volume during the pandemic, that part has been removed. The paper process has been removed. So it has been left up to the employee to report their wages and how much they have earned. And so in doing that, there is no knowledge that they understand if their weekly benefit amount is $350 and they earn $375, that wipes them out. And so, if they are just receiving state benefits, getting upset and the anxiety level is a little bit lower, but with the $600 in addition to that, and the $600 for 13 weeks, I can tell you there have been many near revolts, I think, in offices that I've talked to with coworkers saying, well, you work 20 hours, I worked 15. I didn't qualify for benefits and I didn't get paid a benefit amount of $600 over a couple of dollars extra that I made. So there was a big learning process, of why that causes that. And so now the next real phase that we're really moving into are separation issues. So separation issues of people do not want to return to work. People, do not feel safe about returning to work. And then, but before that even, there's still separation issues of initial claims of where somebody said they voluntarily quit. Or if it was a normal, not a normal, but a termination. And so those are, separation issues that have to still be adjudicated by a hearings officer. And so those are also a huge amount of cases that have to be worked. So the volume of phone calls are, hey, I filed in the first week of April or the second week of April now, I think we're working. I still haven't received anything, any notice, what's going on. I'm doing my weekly certification. I would say probably 75% of those are people that have a separation issue, meaning that they were either terminated or they voluntarily quit, or they had an issue that was unresolved from a previous claim, but within the same year, within the same benefit year. So meaning that they may have had an unresolved issue back from December or back from January, February before this started. And so that issue still has to be removed. The other common questions and problems, people, there's, and that we're trying to do a better job of explaining this, that, there's 3 hurdles to filing for unemployment and receiving benefits. The first one is that you receive monetary compensation, that you have $3,000 in wages reported in the previous quarters for you, so you qualify monetarily. And then the separation is a qualification. Was the separation because, at no fault of your own, or were you terminated? And that is part of a qualification. And then the third hurdle is the weekly certification. You have to weekly be able and available for work. Well, during a pandemic, that has caused issues. I'm not sure if I'm able and available, maybe I'm sick. Those type of issues have come up. But you have to, in that weekly certification, you have to report your wages, be available for work to qualify. So those are kind of how the calls have gone. It started out with, where do I call? How do I file? And now we are seeing, all these separation issues that have to be worked out. And it just could not be a worst case scenario in that you come from a point where the economy is the best it's ever been. So your staffing levels of deputies and hearing officers that adjudicate these cases are at the lowest levels. And then, you go from that to an enormous amount of workload and of training and hiring new deputies to adjudicate all these issues. It's quite the challenge. So hopefully you can see employer services, employer reporting work refusals and recent hires. So the agency on their homepage, on their website, they have created a link for employers. It's just for employers to report any rehires or new hires of employees, also to report any work refusals. And so it's a form that you can fill out that takes you, I think if I click on this link, I'm not sure if it's is that sharing?
Not sharing.
Yeah, I figured it wouldn't with,
I will, let me see.
because
Well, they have it on the screen. They have it on the screen. So if everybody wants to just capture that.
So this is the actual form. And so you recently attempted to recall an employee from a layoff or a furlough. I've received funds from the Small Business Administration, PPP, and paying wages to the person, or you recently hired or rehired an individual. So, what that will do is, when you report that issue or report that someone has been rehired and they go to file their weekly certification, then that will cause an issue on their claim. They will not get paid benefits until that issue is removed from a deputy, from a hearings officer. So that is, the number one tool of reporting people that are refusing to come to work. And of course, I'm not going to go down the path of having to adjudicate all those cases, but exactly what John said earlier, on some of these cases, it's going to be individual. Do you have an underlying health condition? Can you supply a doctor's note that says, hey, we are still in phase 1 or phase 2. I do have a, chronic condition. Here's my doctor's note. Still be eligible for benefits. Those cases are going to have to be, adjudicated on a case-by-case basis, unless, and if the employers, are providing materials. I mean, it will be, interesting to see how all of those work, especially too with the, childcare issue.
Yeah.
What do you do in summer when there isn't any childcare anyway? How do you balance that out? Or is it simply that you cannot find a provider because everyone has, overcrowded the market? So there are issues that will come up on, on that. So virtual job fairs. So Tim Saunders has started with the Workforce Development Board here. He used to be with WDBJ. He's been working on doing virtual job fairs. So if you have any questions and want to do some hiring and have Tim help post some items like that, get in contact with him, or Ben Bowman can put you in touch with him. And then the next slide I had was, sorry, let me open that back up, was reopening the center. So it will be, let me go to the next one. Reopening the center, we are planning on doing appointments like the DMV. We do not have a set date yet. We were talking, the first week of June. We are just like every other business here at the center. It has been very difficult to maintain cleaning supplies, maintain paper towels for the restrooms. So we're making sure that we have that stored and available. Screening for appointments. This is something that I have personally tried to do to really communicate. People have the idea that any CareerWorks location or any VEC location, which we've combined into the Virginia CareerWorks system, that we have the ability to do everything. I've had customers come in and say, I'm not leaving until I get a check. And I say, well, you're never leaving then, because we don't print checks. It's, there's no way we can do that. And so people think that that we run the full scale of services, that we can sit you down and we can adjudicate your case right there. We can remove your issue, and we simply can't. The model is not like that. For payments, you either get direct deposit or you get a way to go card, a check card. That check card provider is a third party administrator for the state. So we had a huge backlog of issues on that, because they also are the provider for 3 or 4 other states. So they got really swamped on trying to get these cards out. So we can't, my point being, there are services, you can't come to the front door and say, I want a check card.
Yeah.
I need my new check card. I need my issue removed. And so I'm trying to do a better job when people start calling for the appointments and scheduling and saying, and we are happy to do a video chat like this with you on Google Hangouts to, if you think you want to see someone eye to eye, I understand that. But here at the local office, we are able to, assist you with your PIN number changes, your address changes, and to look up your claim, help you file a new claim. If you wanted to make an appointment to file a new claim, we're able to do that. But we simply do not have the ability to remove the majority of these issues. And even under normal circumstances, that was an area, of frustration, that a customer would come in and have an issue that we cannot resolve, that the call center or a deputy, has to administer. So we are working on that. We do expect to open, in the coming weeks, following the model like the DMV of making appointments, screening people beforehand. We are still debating about how to keep the PCs clean up front, making sure we have enough supplies for if someone wants to come in and use the computer, and being able to make sure that we keep, customers and staff safe. About that, because under normal circumstances, our staff, we will sit side by side, help you type, help you use the mouse, or type it for you. Under the new thing of social distancing of 6 feet, that's impossible. So we're working on being able to, remotely access your computer to help you file and do those type of things. I think that's it.
Thank you, Jason. And I have not quite a few. I have 3 or 4 questions already, so we're gonna start with those. I think, John, you probably want to weigh in on this one. What if you require employees to wear a face covering when they come back to work and they refuse?
Well, that is probably a legitimate safety feature. It's probably a reasonable work rule. So I think you can discipline the employee for doing that. They would have to have a very good reason to avoid discipline or even being terminated for that. But yeah, as an employer, you should be able, unless I can't think of a particular health reason why they would not have to wear a mask, but other than that, I think you can do it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this question, what about, we talked about doctor's notes and how, Schewels, you guys did not require that because you didn't want the doctor's offices to get inundated. But this question says, what about doctor's notes for post-COVID EEs when a construction job site customer requires it? I'm not sure.
So I will just say, if there's a point of clarification, just from Schewel Home perspective, we changed that early on, just as we were following guidance from the CDC, and we've actually kind of gone back on our normal policy of requiring doctor's notes. And with telemedicine and things like that, I mean, there's availability to obviously see a provider a lot easier than there was before, and you don't have to actually go into a doctor's office sometimes. But I guess to understand the question, is it just like someone who's doing like subcontracting is basically?
Yeah, so this would be like you do work for a construction company and they require a doctor's note that post-COVID saying whatever. I think in that case, you have to follow the guidelines of whatever your contractor says, I would think. Let's see. She's clarifying the question. Can we get a doctor's note for an employee that is positive for COVID-19 when a job site construction customer requires it for us to be back on the job? Our customer is requiring a note. That's the clarification. John, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think if your customer is requiring it, you probably are going to be bound by that.
Yeah. Let's see, another question here. What about an employee that comes to work after having been tested and with symptoms and didn't tell employer of either?
Real quick, I'll jump on that. I would say, Christine, that this goes back to that communication piece that you talk to your employees about, hey, if you're exhibiting symptoms, if you think that you might have COVID-19, to let, your manager know, your supervisor, let them contact, the appropriate person. And, for example, our what if scenarios, we said if someone thinks they have it, they let someone know, they go get tested, we require them to stay quarantined until their test results come back.
Yeah,
so,
this question is specific to if they don't tell you and you've disclosed that they need to tell you, can you discipline or fire that employee? John, you got any thoughts?
So that, just to understand the question. So this is an employee who comes back to work after having been diagnosed COVID positive? Is that the question?
That is the question. So then she says they're waiting on test results, but they haven't disclosed that they're waiting on test results.
Well, I think you can certainly send the employee home while waiting on test results. I don't know about discipline. I don't think I would discipline the employee under those circumstances. But you definitely can send them home. There's no question about that.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for that. Jason, this question's for you. You mentioned the employees that the elimination of having to verify wages on the form during COVID. So the employee fills out the form, and let's say their wages are not correct. What are there payback stipulations for employees if they are getting too much money? Is there an auditing procedure for COVID claims?
So yes, there is. I mean, that would be an overpayment. So there's really two things that are important. Well, really three. One is the employer reporting those wages. Well, in the quarterly reports that they do, that they already do to show that they are working. So that would, draw the attention to it. But the other fact is that if they have been fully separated from employment and not earning anything, then the employer can report that new hire or that rehire when they start back. And so that is the biggest cross-reference, other than the quarterly wage reports that are already reported. But yeah, that is the audit process, is from the employer, the new hire report, or a work refusal would be what would be the cross-reference.
Okay.
So yeah, there is, and it's an overpayment.
Got it. Okay, two more questions have come up. Where can I get more details and clarification on the partial unemployment? We're thinking of moving people into part-time instead of furloughing them or laying them off, but it sounds like it might not be better for the employee.
So you can check our website on, traditionally there's a form that you would have to complete, and I'm not sure what the time frame is that, when we will return to that. But otherwise, there's really no difference, other than the employee has to report their wages. The other part would be that the employer has to report how many hours were offered. So you're right. I have had customers, employers call and ask me and say, hey, I just want to give everybody a 3-day weekend. They're only going to work 32 hours a week. And I can tell you, everybody makes $20 an hour, so they're going to earn more than the $378. Are they not going to qualify? Correct. They're not going to qualify. If they earn more than their weekly benefit amount, they do not qualify, and then they do not qualify for the additional $600 from the feds. That is lasting until the end of July. So correct. Yeah. If you just reduce their hours, one day, and they still earn more than their benefit amount, then correct. They would not receive a benefit.
Okay. Two more questions, and I think, Jason, these are both for you. Any special handling for an employee terminated with cause while under the PPP loan? Non-COVID related cause, regular employment issue.
Yeah, no. So on that, it will be, that's one of many cases. It will be adjudicated just like it would under normal circumstances. The employer will get the separation report where you can mark and note, what happened, the reason for all of that. When they file, they will mark that was a termination, and it will be adjudicated. So there's nothing to it. On the PPE, on reporting that about, I don't know what those reporting requirements are.
Okay.
For that.
And this one listed, Jason or John, how will employers be impacted by all of these layoff unemployment claims or partial unemployment claims? Will the employer be harmed with all the UI claims going forward?
So I'll go ahead and say, John, yeah, the answer is yes. Unfortunately, even though it's a pandemic, taxes are going to go up. There's no way to get around that, unfortunately. To say they're not would be insane. Virginia is still a experience-based state, meaning the more claims you have against your account, the more that is paid out, the higher your tax rate goes. Is that to say some federal legislation or some offset, something may not help? Of course, but I'm sure, it doesn't seem that long ago to me, there was a fund builder tax that was added on in addition to the pool tax, in addition to the regular tax for unemployment insurance from 08, 9, and 10. I think that fund builder tax probably came off maybe in 16 or 17. So yes, it is still a, depending on what is passed legislatively to help, the trust fund will still have to meet the requirements and be replenished. So yes. John, do you have anything?
Yeah. May I add, it's my understanding, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, that the $600 federal supplement will not be counted as far as employer debits, essentially.
Correct. Yeah, that is federal. But in order to qualify for that 600, you have to get at least $1 of state benefits. So that means at least, at least some amount, is still getting charged to that employer account. So yes, nothing was waived. That Virginia is an experience-based state.
Thank you all. I do not see any more questions in the chat or the Q&A feature. So on behalf of the Alliance, I just want to thank you all, gentlemen, for providing your expertise and your wisdom today on this call. Given how many people we have watching and the questions that have come up, I know today was helpful. Couple of quick announcements. First of all, I want to congratulate all those that won elections yesterday. Yesterday was an election day in the city. And to all those that got out and voted, whether absentee or battled the rain yesterday, right? Because yesterday was not a fun day to get out and vote, but congratulations to our members that were elected or reelected. Couple things. Next week's Wednesdays at 1, it is Memorial Day week, and we are going to take a week off. We hope some of you all, even if you're not going to Virginia Beach, which is reopened, or one of the beaches in North Carolina, that you get out your kiddie pool and you take a break next week a little bit. And hopefully, I think we're getting all the rain out of the way, so next week should be okay. The following week, Wednesdays at 1, that will be the first Wednesday in June, we have Stephen Murray, who is the CEO of the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, who will be on talking about what does recovery look like from a statewide economic development perspective, and how do we make sure that business stays a great state for business and manufacturing. So be prepared for that. Also wanted to talk with you all about, we've done industry sector focus groups for all of our top industry sectors in the region. And one of the things that kept coming up was some signage to help, as we reopen, how do we help consumers safely respect some of these individual requirements that some of the employers might have? Because it's going to be different for restaurants and retail than it's going to be for a manufacturer. So we are working on a sample library for you all. Stay tuned on our COVID resource hub and in our e-blast next week. We will have those resources to you, and all you have to do is just download that library, and you can use whatever signs are applicable for you all. Let's see if there's any other announcements. I think that's all I have. What I would say to you all is enjoy the rest of your week. Stay dry, stay well, and final question somebody is asking, Stuart, what is the equation on the wall behind you? So even though we're not going to go into all the details, you must explain what that is.
It is, it's just, I just put it up there to make myself look smart. That's all. That's it. Nothing to it. No, it's a return on investment human capital equation. So that's what it is. So.
Return on investment human capital equation. Very, very good.
Yep.
Very, very good. So, all right, guys, thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your week and stay well, everyone.
Thank you, Christine.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Stay safe. See ya.